Right, so over the last few days, a piece of video footage has been doing the rounds of Donald Trump's new running mate for the US presidency, JD Vance, attacking the UK in a blatantly and horrible example of blatant Islamophobia, in what was meant by him to be some kind of humorous aside to the throng of assembled MAGA hat-wearing muppets listening to him, where he posited to himself what the first Islamist country to possess a nuclear weapon would be, and he decided it was the UK. Makes you wonder what kind of special relationship we'd have with a Keir Starmer-led government versus a Trump-led one following that, wouldn't it? Obviously, last time we had Britain Trump in charge here, didn't we? Boris Johnson. The Donald loved him, but Starmer? He'll be a quisling sycophant towards Trump. But the truth is, if Vance did his homework, he'd see Starmer as much more their man than at first glance. But then when you look at Vance and his track record, who this guy actually is, he might just make Trump and his views look dull by comparison, and possibly too much even for Starmer. Right, so let's take a look at who this guy, James David Vance, JD Vance, is. The Republican nominee for vice president as he is, has only been a senator for Ohio, actually, since last year, so his career growth has been fast, to say the least, but he is seriously bad news in a quite possibly way worse than Trump kind of a way. It would be very easy, given how I've started to describe Vance, that he would just be another far-right knuckle-dragging idiot in the mould of Donald Trump, but he's not. He knows exactly what he's saying and exactly what he's doing. He's far cleverer than that. And whilst Labour figures like Angela Rayner might describe his language as a bit fruity, it was ardently racist and an insult to this country and the multiculturalism that has enriched it for decades. But if you find out a little bit more about Vance, Labour's hand-wringing over calling him out for his comments, describing the UK as an Islamist state, blatant Islamophobia, the failure of Labour to call it out becomes all the more abhorrent. But equally, you might see just how well Starmer even, and a joint Trump-Vance ticket might actually get along. But not in any way people with a sense of decency here would ever want them to. Vance is a former Marine, served in Iraq, was a combat correspondent, likes to play on apparent working class roots, wrote a book all about them apparently, which got turned into a film, Hillbilly Elegy, when in fact he's Ivy League educated and following the military became a venture capitalist. And his time in the Senate, only since January 2023 as I mentioned, has seen him described variously as a right-wing populist, so very Donald Trump you would think on the surface, but also as a national conservative, represented by his adherence to more traditional conservative thinking and social conservative thinking, but differs on how he thinks the economy ought to be run from that. So, for instance, he backs things like the abortion ban, he is against same-sex marriage, but he backs trade unions and workers striking for better pay deals. So, very hard line on some things, not so on others. Democratic debate on these matters be damned, though, because he's also described as what's called a neo-reactionary, and this is where things take a much darker turn, and why Vance should, above all else, and what I've mentioned briefly already is enough to put most people off, but we've not even got to the worst of it yet. Neo-reactionaryism also goes by another name called Dark Enlightenment, also called the Neo-Reactionary Movement, which gets abbreviated to NRX. And if you switch out that word enlightenment for democracy, then you might have an idea of where this particular rabbit hole is going to take us down. Dark Enlightenment is an elitist kind of anti-democracy. Numerous billionaires love it, especially ones in the tech industry. Proponents of it include people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, both of whom set up PayPal, and both of whom are funders of the Trump campaign. In fact, Thiel donated $15 million to Vance's Senate campaign and allegedly took him to see Trump to patch up their differences after Vance had previously called himself a never-Trumper, even going as far as to compare Trump to Hitler at one point, all that adding to a more moderate depiction of Vance to the US public than is actually the case. Thiel is also CEO of Palantir Technologies, which is an AI tech firm, spyware firm, who in January of this year agreed a deal with Israel in the middle of its genocide in Gaza, agreed to a strategic partnership with them and their defense ministry to provide assistance with its war efforts. Did I mention Vance is also ardently pro-Israel? Must have slipped my mind. Every time this guy calls out the deep state, and he does a lot, the reality is he actually is the deep state. Influences on Vance that he has named include a who's who of reactionaries from across the right wing. According to Jewish non-profit publication Forward, Vance's favourite political theorist is a chap called Yoram Hazony, on whom Vance is quoted as saying, "He's sort of a conservative Jew who's written about what Judaism means for national politics, and not national politics meaning specifically this nation, he lives in Israel, but just what it means to be a sort of nationalist and a patriot in the context of the Hebrew and Christian traditions. Vance said, "So Yoram's been quite influential to me." Hazony is described in the same article as having been the godfather of Benjamin Netanyahu's efforts to drastically reduce the power of independent judiciary in Israel. In other words, the legal system stopping Netanyahu going as far as he actually might quite like to. And when it comes to him, can you imagine what he'd get away with if he circumvented Israel's Supreme Court? I mean, look at what he's already getting away with and gotten away with. But this is the anti-democratic demagoguery that Vance appears to embrace. Another influence of his is a guy called Curtis Yarvin, who, along with British philosopher Nick Land, founded Dark Enlightenment, which I mentioned earlier. Anti-democratic, anti-social equality. The whole philosophy they subscribe to, the clue in the name, is opposition to the so-called Age of Enlightenment we all live in now, that marked the shift essentially from the Dark and Middle Ages to the 17th and 18th centuries and so on and so forth to today. The belief is that freedom is incompatible with democracy, and when Nick Land was writing essays on his Dark Enlightenment, for it was he that coined that phrase, one of his influences at that time was, and we come full circle a bit here, Peter Thiel again. Fundamentally, the movement is marked by a belief we should do away with democracy and return to the subservience of an absolute monarchy, mind, an end to the liberties we might all take for granted, eugenics and accelerationism, which is an extremely concerning ideology, and it isn't unique to the far right either. It can be far left as well. But if you believe in the whole horseshoe model of the political spectrum, that might not be a huge surprise to you either. But accelerationism, from the right-wing perspective, is the belief that to promote the change you want, a crisis must be manufactured to which your views become the answer. It's manufacturing your own political will and enforcing it, essentially, which in an anti-democratic society, in an authoritarian fascist dictatorship, will have the people cheering you on as you do it. We've seen that before in the past, haven't we? This could include murder, it can include terrorism, it could involve literally overthrowing government in an insurrection perhaps. Essentially, it creates fascism. To my mind, this is exactly what Hitler did. A man whose actions Curtis Yarvin, Vance's influencer, has previously stated some of his invasions were actually in self-defense. Dark Enlightenment also subscribes to a belief in hyper-racism, which discusses eugenics and treats racism as a positive. Well, Vance certainly thinks attacking Muslims is politically expedient for him, as we've seen, if you've seen that video footage going around, and this blends with accelerationism, which explicitly includes racist views. If you want an idea of what such a society as this would look like, government would essentially be replaced with a sovereign or sovereign body. In a nation like the US, what would that look like then? You'd probably be looking at something like a sovereign stock corporation or a group of them with shareholders. And we all know they are the people with wealth, of course, so forget equality, which is par for the course with this, who would elect an executive with total power, but who would serve at the shareholders' pleasure. So you would end up with a CEO monarchy, if you will. King Elon Musk, perhaps. If you can imagine such a thing, it sounds completely batshit, doesn't it? But this is what Vance subscribes to. By naming his influences as he has, and who these people are, and what they've founded, and what they stand for, and what they believe in, this is what Vance subscribes to. According to Yarvin, the US is soft on crime, that democracy and the economy as societal focuses are delusional, America is ruled by communists, political correctness is just an excuse to persecute racist views, and if Americans want to change their government to something better, they need to get over their dictator phobia. Yarvin also believes we should bring back slavery, and some races are more suited to racism than others, and believe the IQ of white people is superior. This is insane stuff to listen to read. You can imagine the number of times my jaw dropped, frankly, whilst doing the research for this video, because it seems the most incredulous, insanely barmy stuff in this day and age. But there it is. And as a neo-reactionary, JD Vance subscribes to this kind of thinking, and those associated with it are his influences, as he's apparently said, and are pitching in their cash in this belief too, if they've got the funds to do so, as billionaire backers and people who subscribe to this thinking as well clearly are. Elon Musk, as an example, as a proponent of this, as I mentioned earlier, is, for example, throwing $45 million a month at Trump's campaign via a new Trump super PAC. But Trump isn't a proponent of these far-right beliefs. Vance is. And it goes to show even the far right can hate others on the far right when it comes down to basic ideology. And it makes you wonder how well they would actually work together, and whether Trump will adopt Vance's views and ideologies, or whether Vance will struggle to cut through when Trump's name is no longer useful to get him and his beliefs where he wants to be. So why in all of this would he get on with our Labour government here then, Damo? Where's the common ground then? Well, Labour's hierarchy of racism is well documented. I've certainly done numerous videos relating to it, and Labour still won't act upon it. This is why it lost so many Muslim votes in the general election. Vote Starmer is not making any overtures to get back by allowing bad losers and current Labour MPs to attack those who defeated their colleagues. Vance, with his anti-Islamist rhetoric, would likely admire that. The level of authoritarianism, well documented but woefully underreported by the main media of Keir Starmer, something that journalist Peter Oborne has recently spoken out on Double Down News, would be something else he'd have in common with such ideologies as Vance holds, though to what extent is open to debate. I'd like to think Starmer wasn't that far gone, but for the sake of the special relationship, who can be sure? And aside from anything else, these ideologies or some of the inspiration for some of the people and their philosophies I've mentioned here already have a footing here in the UK, you might be alarmed to know, and even more alarmed to find out that that's also the case within Starmer's government, potentially. You see, if you're looking for some kind of dark, fetid source, some kind of demonic portal where viewpoints such as these might find common cause and infect the UK, look no further than this chap here, still lurking in corners amid the Starmer administration. It might not surprise you one iota that this is a chap to be involved here. Peter Mandelson. Mandelson has a consultancy firm called Global Counsel, and they were instrumental in getting government contracts from the Ministry of Defence here and the NHS awarded to Palantir, a firm owned by Peter Thiel. Yes, him, yet again. Palantir's UK arm happens to be headed by a chap called Louis Mosley, the grandson of British Union of Fascist leader Oswald Mosley, funnily enough too. It's a really disturbing web of relationships, ideologies and ambitions laid out here, but all in all, I think a Trump-Vance US administration would have no problems at all getting along with our Starmer-led government, and that should at the very least elicit some concern and some desire. Just keep an eye on things if the US happens to vote to put Trump back into the White House. Meanwhile, even if Labour turn out to be less keen than they might like to cosy up to a Trump administration, you can bet Nigel Farage will welcome such an administration with open arms. After all, he did desert his constituents within 10 days to rush to Trump's side the other day. It's just a shame he came back again, really. Get the details of that sham in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.